Hello everyone. I will make a start because we're on time for 11:45, and obviously people are welcome to join us throughout. And Claire in the back over here is filming it as well, so we'll be available to catch up on. So my talk is about applying the CIRIA C790 code of practice in real-world flood resilience projects. So I'll start with a little bit about who I am. So I am the gentleman in the photo on the left. I'm Simon Crowther, a civil engineer, chartered water and environment manager, a fellow of CIWEM, and 2007 flood victim as well. And the photograph on the right is the lovely team of flood risk consultants and engineers that are in my team at the FPS Group, which is a company I established in 2012. But where did my passion come from for flood risk management, raising awareness? Well, this was my family home in 2007. We were flooded 5 times that summer. We had no idea we were at risk of flooding. The flood mapping there at the time didn't account for surface water. We weren't near a river, we weren't near the sea, and it was totally unexpected and incredibly disruptive. And I wanted to make sure other families and businesses didn't have to go through the same impact. So I've made it my mission ever since. And you probably saw on the first slide, I'm also known as the flood guy. This actually came about from a Sky News producer when I turned up to be interviewed outside a flood in York, and they were like, "Oh, the flood guy's here." And I thought, they can never remember my name, but they always call me the flood guy. So if they're going to do that, I may as well run with it. So trademarked the flood guy, and since about 2020, have been known as that. So if we start with a little bit of a recap on 2025, a recap on the year, what advances have we had? Well, firstly, there's been new national standards for sustainable drainage systems, which is setting out updated criteria, a 7-step process to try and utilize and make sustainable drainage mandatory in schemes to better manage surface water, which is really pleasing. We have also had the formation of IPFRA, the International Property Flood Resilience Association, which is a group of companies within the sector coming together to work collaboratively, drive up standards, and ensure that we can all work towards a shared goal of improving flood risk management. And IPFRA are here with Darren, and also on stand EO3 if you want to pop by later. We've also had something called FloodReady, which was a report published or commissioned by the Environment Agency, working with Professor Peter Bomfield, looking at, again, how do we utilize flood risk management better and reduce the impact. But fundamentally, a lot of these things all require us to have them underpinned by good practice. And although it's been out for some time, I think it was 2019 or 2020, the voluntary code of practice our industry works by is called CIRIA C790. And I wanted to touch on, when it comes to managing flood risk, how this underpins the work we do. The problem is not many people have heard of it even 5 years on. So I thought a great opportunity with the advances we've had this year to discuss it in more detail and look at why there's so many steps involved, and address some of the issues where people might feel, why all the surveys, why costs up front, and some of the challenges along the way. So there's 6 stages. We've got number 1, which is a risk assessment. So that's understanding flood maps, downloading and obtaining model data, historic flood mapping. Then there's a survey, which is some ground truthing and analysis of the property to better understand the lie of the land, what the construction is, where the drains potentially flow. Then on to options development and design, which is looking in more detail at certain areas and then formulating different options outputs, followed by construction, commissioning and handover, and operation and maintenance. So I thought I'd use the simple t-test of why skipping stages don't work. So a good way to think about this is perhaps making a cup of tea. You will fill the kettle, boil the water, put a tea bag in the mug, or a teapot perhaps, pour the water in, let it brew, remove the bag, and add the milk or sugar. Problem is, if you take one of those stages out or do it in the wrong order, you could end up with a completely different drink and not what was intended. Now, that's exactly the same with the CIRIA Code of Practice. If things are done in the wrong order, generally doesn't lead to the results that we want, which is the nice cup of tea. So stages 1 and 2 are risk assessment and survey. They're all about clarity, what's the risk, and then when you arrive on site, things like, does the mapping match what's happened? What are the assumptions in that model? Is the model assuming that there might be a curb there that's not there? Is the model perhaps too coarse that it's not picking up that there's a really low area by this door and that's why that door's pooling? So to give a sort of visual indication, stage 1, you can imagine at a computer looking at model data, information that's readily available, and stage 2, out on site doing data collection. The stage 2 is really important because it allows you to collect data that doesn't show up in the map. So it might be that the floor level's raised or the floor level's actually lower, or there's risk areas below a predicted flood level, like an air brick that could quite easily be resolved. You'll see on the screen the chap doing the survey is doing it on an iPad. This is something we do in our team. It creates a digital record of the building, a measured survey, all of the apertures, the height of the apertures, the different routes of ingress, so that following on from stage 2, whatever you do next, you've always got a measured survey to refer back to that also has on it locations of drains, manholes, inspection chambers, etc. So that if you then find you might need a CCTV drainage survey, you've got a plan that shows where everything is, always to refer back to digitally. And the floor plan will also have numbers on that digitally link to the photographs you record. So it's a very, very handy way of recording the information. And of course, back in the day when we used to go out 10 years ago with a piece of paper, you've obviously got the opportunity that you might lose that, and then the added time of having to create a CAD drawing when you got back to the office. So it's very time saving and efficient, and also because it's utilizing the iPad's LiDAR, the measurements tend to be very, very accurate as well. But I always say when you're out on site, you need to think of yourself as a detective. It's like forensics, going, why did that happen? What was the cause of this? Has something changed that's made the floodwater behave in that way? Has there been a drainage system implemented we don't know about? Has there been a flood wall built we don't know about? Why's that happened? Perhaps exactly what you expected to happen did, but then how's that impacted the property? And it's also about more than just the maps. So the photo on the right, I was actually looking for a before and sadly couldn't find one, but you might notice and spot that the gully pot, the little drain for the downpipes, sort of mid-installation there. And the reality is when doing the survey, that door kept having water ingress through it. And if you zoomed out from the maps, well, it wasn't really surprising. The downpipe for the roof went straight onto the floor with no drain connection, and the door had no threshold and wasn't sealed underneath. So pretty much every time it rained, the house was flooding. So it's picking up all the different nuances on site as well that tie together to make a really informed data collection. And again, I talk about there can be some frustration as to why all these steps are needed. And the next slide was an interesting one, which is perhaps a nice example of where by following the right process, it can save money. Because if we were having this presentation 5-10 years ago, it'd be more likely that you'd have someone that was out to create sales of flood barrier equipment instead, as opposed to doing a detailed risk assessment, and would no doubt advise that one of the properties in this question needed a full suite of flood mitigation measures. But actually, when we obtained the river data, the model data for this river, and then did a survey of the property, it became apparent that the floor level of the property was actually significantly higher than the most extreme mapped flood. The garden would flood, but the mapping doesn't take account for the actual internal floor level of a property. So the output of the report was that although the garden is inundated with water, actually the house was quite above the predicted level. And that allowed an informed decision to be made as to what was the right thing to do there. And it wasn't going to be spending £10,000 to £15,000 fitting flood barriers if they weren't needed. It could be actually thinking of next time they do some gardening, looking at planting in a way that actually helps with the flood risk. So you can have some really good outputs actually from getting that data. Now, when doing these sort of steps, I always like to think it's a bit of an overlap between the construction style, the risk, and the client goals. It's no use the client saying, I really want to put flood barriers on if the risk shows that the water's going to be 1 meter deep and the building is built from single skin. It's just not going to work. So you have to balance everything. And it's really important to ask the right questions and treat that site survey as a consultation. Now, stage 3. This, I would actually say, is probably my favorite stage because it's the opportunity to look in a lot more detail. But a recent conversation that someone had with us was, I don't want any of this. I want people here with shovels, digging trenches and building walls. And it's frustrating because I understand their sentiment. I understand that when you've been flooded, it's stressful, and the next time it rains, you're worried. And you think all of this might be unnecessary and you just want to build the flood wall. But the problem is, if you build the flood wall and it has drains running underneath it, you haven't built a flood defense, you've built a moat that fills up on the inside and have totally wasted your money. Or the flood wall might divert the water and impact other people. So it's really important to make sure this stage is right. And the breadth of this stage really depends on the project. So if it was a low sort of value grant funding project where there was no funding for things like flood walls or improved drainage schemes, you'd have a more limited stage here. But the brilliance of this stage is it can be tailored to the project. So it really depends on what the end goal is or what the site tailors itself towards. So there's lots of different things that can involve. But the drainage design that's actually in the background here, this started off in life as what was a low value grant-funded survey where there was £5,000 available for property flood mitigation. But actually, after talking to the homeowner on site, they were in Australia for 6 months of the year, so they were never going to be able to deploy anything. And being the sort of forensic detective flood surveyor, the mapping wasn't quite right for what was happening on the site. And through a bit of interrogation, it became clear they'd put an extension on the back of this barn. But to put the extension on, they'd had to excavate the land and put in a retaining wall. Seems okay. Until we established where the spoil had gone for digging the land out, and it had been regraded on the driveway. And that was the old flow path for water. So water used to flow past the house, down the driveway, and that's what the mapping was showing. But this time it flowed into the garden, couldn't escape, and completely flooded. So the homeowner said, look, I know the grant's only £5,000. I would like to sort this properly. What can I do? So the stage 3 was then looking in a lot more detail at things like CCTV drainage designs, topographical surveys. And actually, one aspect could have been to regrade the land again, or another one could have been a drainage design like this that was modeled in micro drainage and was actually quite a cost-effective way of managing their flood risk and was able to be discharged to their own land. But stage 3 can involve lots of other things as well. So I mentioned CCTV drainage surveys, obtaining information as well from the Drainage Authority. If you want to put in, for instance, a flood wall, we'd look at displacement calculations to make sure we weren't making the risk worse for other people. Then you've got things like structural designs, foundation designs, what's the soil type like? Do we need planning permission? Do we need an environmental permit? Do we need listed building consent? What material selection do we need? How might that integrate with the property? What should the product specification be? If we're looking at a water pump, do we need to do friction loss calculations to make sure the flow is correct? Do we need to do any modelling, any drainage calculations? Do we need input from ecologists, quantity surveyors, structural engineers? Do we need to do design risk assessments for the lifetime of this and how it's going to be maintained? And considering things like what's actually buildable, what's the access like? And then considering things as well like resilient repair, and what the compatibility might be. If it's a new property, heritage property, we have to consider all those sorts of things. And I think what I need to call on here is for everyone's help in actually explaining the benefits of following this process and wider support, which is why I wanted to share it, because something came across my desk the other day that had been shared from a colleague, and it was an inquiry from a building company that had got planning permission to develop their land. And part of the planning permission was that they needed to fit PFR, property flood resilience. But they were interpreting the requirements in a very interesting way, which didn't sit well. They said, well, the drawings and commentary only refers to the flood barrier rails. We don't want to buy the actual barriers, we just want to screw rails to the wall. If the people who move in decide they want to buy the barriers that then actually slot in the rails, that's fine, but we only want to put the rails on the wall. And I thought that is what we're up against. They weren't actually bothered with the fundamental aspect of the flood barrier. They just wanted to screw a rail to the wall and say they ticked their planning requirement, which to me was absolutely crazy. And so on, different sides of things, we've got that sort of attitude to some elements, but then also I don't want any of this. I want people with shovels digging trenches and building walls. And obviously they're completely different motives, but still down to sort of everyone to look at the importance of this stage. And sometimes I'll even get my hands dirty myself too. Building into this stage is things like, if we're looking at a driveway flood barrier, like I mentioned, the compensatory storage, or how's that impacting elsewhere on the floodplain to make sure we're not making things worse, and also analysing the drainage routes to make sure non-return valves are placed in the right place, are the right style, and then tying that into your design risk assessment, thinking, is that going to be serviceable? How's that going to be in the future if the chamber's much, much deeper? Would that then be a confined space install? And considering all of these things, where it's very easy to just go, I need a non-return valve, and not consider the true implications of doing a proper project. And the reason I like the CIRIA Code of Practice is because of that stage 3 following on, it allows you to treat any size of project correctly, because it's just a fundamental engineering process, and you can really bulk out the stage 3 depending on what the what the project requires. So stages 4 and 5, that's commissioning and handover. And again, this depends on what was found, what the budgets are. Back to that slide where I mentioned about balancing everything. So the photo on the left here actually was an initial site survey, and then a drainage survey found that actually the surface water drains had totally collapsed. They were really, really old. And so effectively what was sort of a PFR, Property Flood Resilience Project, became much bigger because it was identified that the drainage needed to be reconstructed, which meant a redesign was needed. And then when you're doing a redesign, you can include things like the non-return valves and look at infiltration rates and model the site. So it's just following the engineering process. Some of the things are key in this area as well that tie in. Like I mentioned, it's good to have the right process in terms of thinking about whether CDM regulations tie in, whether we need structural checks, consents, and then tied into this was commissioning and handover. And it's why with the sort of delivery of a scheme, you want to have a nice information pack. If you've used concrete on the floor, well, what concrete was it? If we ever need to replace it, if you need to look at putting some more sealant behind a flood barrier, or what sealant did you use? And just including all of that information as you would in a sort of commercial project with a health and safety handover pack, but thinking about that along with the sort of justification for material choices. And 10 years' time, if a wall needs repointing, well, what was it pointed with the first time? And these photos give a sort of breadth of complexity. So top left is a flood wall being constructed with steels going to the foundation, and then that will be filled in the middle with concrete, through to simpler things like a flood barrier being fitted to a doorway. And then the bottom left photo shows the ground strip being installed for a flood barrier. And again, that's the sort of thing when you give the handover pack. Well, what concrete was used there in the ground strip so that if it ever needs to be repaired, replaced, etc. in the future, you know what was used. Then following on from that is stage 6, which is operation and maintenance. So that's making sure the client, homeowner, business owner, local authority, whoever it's been handed over to, recognizes when the equipment might need maintenance, how they maintain it, and having a plan in place, but also thinking about the operation, the deployment, whether operatives are trained, whether they have a dry run every year, how they actually integrate that so that when the equipment is or scheme is used, they know how it's going to use, how it's going to work, how they deploy the equipment, and fundamentally achieve the right outcomes. Because over the past 10, 20 years, there's been challenges where there's been reports of flood barriers failing or not working. And a lot of the time it's the wrong language. Where flood barriers have failed, it might be that they were overtopped, like the storm event was too great, that they worked right up until the design criteria, or actually deploying a flood barrier to local level and saying, well, it leaked. And you think, looking at these seals, I'm not surprised. Or as the case may be with the story I told earlier, going to deploy the flood barriers and realizing you've only got the rails and not the actual barriers. So it's important to tie it all together with the operation and maintenance plan that then closes off the project really nicely, and you know things have been done properly. And it's good to have trade bodies and professional organizations now, such as IPFRA, where the industry can work together to deliver this. And if we sort of see examples of projects which aren't following the right criteria, it's much easier as an industry to stand together and call out that behavior and actually push for the right standards in schemes. And whilst it might have more upfront cost, it might be that the actual overall cost is lower, and certainly the benefits delivered will be better. So that was my last slide, I'm open to questions. Equally, if people want to connect, feel free to add me on LinkedIn or visit our website. You can scan the QR code to have a look, or drop me an email. Or we also have a stand over in that direction as well. But thank you for listening, and hopefully that was informative and you can help me in spreading the word as to why these different stages are important. Thank you.